Hi, my name is John Dixon, and today I'm going to talk about the occult, specifically its influence on Renaissance-era literature. But first, I want to give you some definitions. Someone completely unfamiliar with the subject would and should find themselves completely unbalanced and out of their league when approaching the subject for the first time. The idea of the occult itself produces a myriad of disjointed pictures in the new studier's mind. Woodcuts of witch sabbats, frescoes of the devil, images of Kronos devouring his newborns. There are as many avenues of occultism as there are fragments of Christianity, perhaps more. But occultism, as defined in this video, is referring to Western occultism as described by Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa in his work on the subject entitled De Occulta Philosophia. In it he states, I do not doubt but the title of our book of occult philosophy or of magic may by the rarity of it allure many to read it, amongst which some of a crazy judgment, and some that are perverse will come to hear what I can say, who by their rash ignorance may take the name of magic in the worst sense, and though scarce having seen the title, cry out that I teach forbidden arts, sow the seed of heresies, offend pious ears and scandalize excellent wits, that I am a sorcerer and superstitious and devilish, who indeed am a magician. To whom I answer, that a magician doth not amongst learned men signify a sorcerer, or one that is superstitious or devilish, but a wise man, a priest, a prophet, and that the Sibyls were magicianesses, and therefore prophesied most clearly of Christ, and that magicians, as wise men, by the wonderful secrets of the world, knew Christ, the author of the world, to be born, and came first of all to worship him, and that the name of magic was received by philosophers, commended by divines, and not unacceptable to the gospel. In his Occult Philosophia, he talks about rituals and spells. He gives an underlying theory of the cosmos that encompasses astrology, numerology, and a lot of Kabbalistic concerns. He even gives a theory on the nature of how and why magic works. Agrippa didn't believe himself to be a parlor illusionist like the magicians that we think of nowadays. Rather, he was a serious theologian who believed that the study of this subject allowed men to ascend even higher and protect themselves from baneful influences. In other words, occultism, as referenced in this video, refers to the Western idea of ceremonial magic, that one can derive the power to influence reality according to his will in conjunction with borrowing the power of God and studying nature. As an aside, this is hardly scratching the whole scope of the subject. Now, you may be asking, well, what does the occult have to do with literature? A whole heaping lot is what I'm here to say. Covering every ounce of occult references and influence on the whole scope of literature in general would be a monumental lifelong task. The echoes of its study can be found in almost every fantasy, science fiction, or horror novel published in the English language. Instead, I've decided to hone in my focus. This project is specifically about fictional literature in vogue at the time of the Renaissance, as opposed to grimoires or spellbooks as literature, which, honestly, there's enough in existence that I could do a whole paper on that alone. But first, some scene setting. Renaissance England was a time of change. The age of reason was dawning its head. Scientific progress was being made in leaps and bounds. Elizabeth's father, King Henry, had separated England from the Catholic Church in order to remarry. In this power struggle, the common folk had their own concerns about what to do in a time when reality itself and their perception of it seemed to be changing. When his death had occurred, the resulting power shift in Game of Thrones led Elizabeth to eventually be crowned Queen of England in November 17th of the year 1558. This lasted until her death on March 24th in 1603. Queen Elizabeth at this point was 22 years old. She was a young woman. There are lots of conspiracy theories about her life and circumstances, one of which is the fact that she was actually a man. But although fascinating, they're not the subject of this video. Though she was a Protestant, in opposition to her staunchly Catholic sister, she was still fascinated with the occult and all things mysterious and romantic. This love of the weird is what catapulted Shakespeare and Marlowe to such heights of admiration and popularity. The question becomes then, where did this yearning come from? I can't hope to answer this question directly, but I do have ideas. As to the influence of occult ideas on Elizabeth, only one person comes to mind. Dr. John Dee. Though he had no formal doctorate, John Dee was known as a doctor due to his expansive knowledge in all sorts of studies. He had so many jobs and different titles and things that he did for a living as careers. I can't name them on one hand. He was an extremely learned man. He was a mathematician, an astronomer, a navigator, an alchemist, a channeler, a scholar, a librarian, all sorts of things. He was one of the Queen's special consultants and was in fact one of the primary pushers for the idea of a British Empire. Dee traveled to many different places during his youth where he studied from countless texts circling Europe at the time. He petitioned Queen Mary at one point to make a royal library, but of course she turned it down, so Dee himself chose to begin a library of his own, which he kept on his own grounds. This was known as a center of learning to a vast majority of Britain's royal courts. A lot of people came and passed through his house, including Philip Sidney, a lot of other, very important men of the time. But the question may be, why is John Dee important? At least as far as this goes. What importance could a librarian have? He's certainly not known for much. In fact, if you don't study the occult, you may never have heard of John Dee. The importance of his work, though, it can't be understated. Just to set the stage for some of the things that happened earlier in his life, and to give you an idea of how closely linked he is with Queen Elizabeth, Dee faced treason for casting horoscopes for both Queen Mary and Elizabeth before she was crowned. Of course, he studied occultism and astrology as part of it, part of the system that he allegedly inherited from Agrippa, amongst other, they call them Neoplatonist occulticians at the time. I don't know if occultician is the right word, but he considered himself a magician as well as a devotee of God, and in his latter days he devoted himself to the channeling of angelic spirits through work with the kind of shisty Edward Kelly. Their story is really fascinating. I could fill a whole research paper on that, but again, that's not the topic of this video. In addition to this, he was one of the primary financiers of Marvin Frobisher's excursion to the north, which was Britain's first strike into colonial expansionism. Not only was he the financier, he was also their primary navigation officer. Basically, what he did was he took advances from basically in mathematics and astronomy and applied them together to bring England into a new age of naval exploration. John Dee is indirectly responsible for all of England's colonial expansionism. So, I mean, if that doesn't tell you how important he is. He was highly influenced by Agrippa, is what some scholars say. Of course, his library was ransacked, so unfortunately we don't have a list of all the books that were in it. I could go on and on about him, but frankly, I'm out of breath. I hope I've underscored the importance of who he was and how high he was in Elizabeth's court. So, needless to say, he's an extremely important man. Now, at this time, there were numerous artists and things like that that rose into prominence during the Elizabethan era. Two very famous playwrights came of age specifically. William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. Although occult themes can be viewed from nearly any literature of the time, these are two prime examples of authors intrinsic to English language that were heavily influenced by its study. One need only take a skimming glance at Shakespeare's works to confirm the occult influence in his writings. Shakespeare has tales of witches, ancient repugnant crones that worship Hecate, and the play Macbeth. Merely quoting some of their delicious banners should remind anyone of their junior year English class. And so, we begin. Double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Fillet of a finny snake, in the cauldron boil and bake. Eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog. Adder's fork and blindworm's sting, lizard's leg and owlet's wing. For a charm of powerful trouble, like a hell broth boil and bubble. And that's far and alone not his only work. In King Lear, he has the eponymous character call upon the various planets as forms of God. He makes an invocation to Apollo, if I'm not mistaken. His jester is a prophet, foretelling the coming of Merlin, another wizard. King Lear at one point curses his eldest daughter with a fertility curse. Though I'm not saying that he's a wizard, his wordcraft is way vitriolic, and it brings to mind that witch belief idea of blasting rods that would destroy fertility in the fields. To quote him directly, Here, nature, here, dear goddess, here, suspend thy purpose if thou didst intend to make this creature fruitful. Into her womb convey sterility. Dry up in her the organs of increase, and from her derogate body never spring a babe to honor her. If she must teem, create her child of spleen, that it may live and be a thwart disnatured torment to her. Let it stamp wrinkles in her brow of youth, with cadent tears fret channels in her cheeks. Turn all her mother's pains and benefits to laughter and content, that she may feel how sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. Away, away! If that's not a curse intended on blasting away her ovaries and drying her up like Egypt, I don't know what is. He sets up a scene that is absolute brilliance when he has the bad guy, Edmund, curse astrology and its merits as idiotic. Edmund states that if his stars were correct, he would be a rough, violent lecher. In a turn of dramatic irony, by the end of the play, Edmund has killed and usurped the throne, and is in the process of wooing 2 women at once. If that's not irony, I don't know what is. And certainly far from the last example, but still an example, we have A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's about a king trying to marry. He bumps into a group of fairies, and a love potion is passed around like a hot potato. Sheer brilliance. Monsters from myth of all kinds permeate the work. Oberon, this is an excerpt, something that Oberon says, "Fetch me that flower, the herb I showed thee once, the juice of it on sleeping eyelids laid, will make or man or woman madly dote upon the next live creature that it sees. Fetch me this herb, and be thou here again, ere the Leviathan can swim a league." Shakespeare is far from the only literary figure influenced by the studies of the occult. Christopher Marlowe is next on our list. Marlowe was a very strange figure in Elizabethan England. He was a counterfeiter, a playwright, a poet, an alleged atheist, and last but not least, a spy. I could wax on for hours about the troves of information available on Marlowe. He studied theology at Cambridge. Riggs states that although astrology had no formal place in the university curriculum, MA candidates routinely studied it and kept notebooks of occult learning. It is evident in his works that Marlowe has more than a passing familiarity with the occult. Take the play Dr. Faustus, for instance. In text, Dr. Faustus refers to one of his friends as Cornelius. This could be a veiled reference to Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, mentioned earlier, one of the foremost occulticians of the Western world. Of course, he outright talks about Agrippa mere lines later, talking about the grimoires and things like that he's made. Dr. Faustus is a doctor who rejects all standard outlets of formal learning, deciding instead to pursue the course of diablerie, or necromancy as they call it in text. His ambition leads to his downfall, but not before he lives his life under a pact with the direct servant of Lucifer himself. Magic, sorcery, necromancy. It makes a pretty compelling case, I think. But there does seem to be a strange correlation between Dr. Faustus and some of the more prominent figures of the time. At this point, we're diving away from established fact and more into theory, but I feel like I want to talk about it since it's a very interesting subject to me. I have literally no solid evidence to support this, but my own personal theory is that Christopher Marlowe, during his time away from college, was dispatched overseas. The time frame matches up, if only a little bit, with that of Marvin Frobisher's voyages to the north. Seeing as these were financed and only possible because of John Dee's forays into navigation and his vision of a British Empire, it seems to be very suspicious to me. The big deal is not only the similarities between Dr. Faustus being a magician and Dr. John Dee, who later in life began the process of channeling angels, as he called them. Faust, at the end of his life, he has nothing left. He's basically pulled to hell at the end of his contract. Dr. Dee, basically, once Elizabeth died, nobody wanted him anymore. Nobody wanted Dee in their house. Nobody wanted him in the country. He was pretty much kicked out from every position. And at the end of his life, he had to sell his valuables one by one. There's a lot of similarities there. Again, to get back on track, he was a huge collector of books. John Dee was. An avid collector of books, of course, because of his huge library. He was heavily influenced in his seafaring days by the records and notes of Flavius Arrianus, a noted maritime expert from Greece or the Roman Empire. Note that name, though, Arianus. Without the records of Flavius Arianus, the expedition to the north would not have been possible. Christopher Marlowe, shortly before his death, was reputed to have owned an anti-Trinitarian tract and given it to a friend he fell out with. The name of the text was The Fall of Arian. Now, Arian was a strange figure. Basically, he argued for a non-Trinitarian idea of God. Basically, that there was a hierarchy, okay, and it went God, who was above everything, who then gave birth to the Son, who then, and then, of course, the Holy Spirit's over here on the side. That's my best understanding of it, as opposed to the Trinitarian view of things that God, the Holy Ghost, and Jesus are all the same because they've all existed at the same time and they are all aspects of each other. This was a big deal back in the Renaissance era, especially with the struggles between the Catholics and the Protestants for control of England. So, it makes sense that he would be prescripted for that. But because of his spy work, because of all the different things that he's done, I find it extremely suspicious that he is libeled with owning a book called The Fall of Arian, and Dee's notes that he used on Arianus. I mean, they sound so similar. As Marlowe was a spy and his disappearance was never explained in college, one can only speculate that perhaps this was code for his travels on the voyage with Frobisher. If this is the case, it's not hard to imagine he would have met or at least known of John Dee, even in passing. In this case, it's not hard to see his influence for the character of Dr. Faustus, which was published shortly after he graduated from Cambridge. Interestingly enough, due to the time frame of Faustus's contract and the alleged initial publication date of the play itself, John Dee's death matches up with the end of the contract, give or take a few years. This is way far from a serious claim. It's kind of like the JFK and Lincoln assassination correlations, kind of a conspiracy theory. I have to wonder, with the influx and very real presence of tons of other self-renowned magicians at the time, like Giordano Bruno, who I believe was an Italian magician and philosopher, another Neoplatonist, as well as, I think in England, Simon Forster, who considered himself an alchemist physician. With tons of figures like that passing through England with legitimate reputations. I wonder if that itself wasn't a valid enough reason for inspiration. Well, that's pretty much all I have to talk about today. One more thing, Edmund Spenser with the Fairy Queen's Court. This is far from the only aspect of, romanticism of occultism. However, Edmund Spenser, to set things up, he was a secretary for Queen Elizabeth in her court. Basically, he wrote the Fairy Queen's Court. He never did finish it. He finished part 1, which was book 1 through 6. And in it, basically, he was establishing the Fairy Queen as Queen Elizabeth herself. And each individual person in the Fairy Queen's court was supposed to represent somebody in her circle of acquaintances at that point. Francis Yates, who actually has an amazing book on this exact same subject, which I just found out about yesterday, she basically claims that Spencer had meant, I believe it was book 2 or book 3, to be specifically about John Dee. That's the influence that he had on all these people of the time, especially literary. I hope that I've covered the coursework or the scope of my research correctly. I hope you've learned a little bit. That's pretty much it for my presentation. I hope that I've illuminated you not only on the existence of actual print grimoires and the presence of occult thought and great men of the time and of all time, but also to illuminate the presence and importance of such figures, especially in application to literary research. Thank you.